In Hitler's mind, the war was already won. For more than 2 hours he spoke, his voice echoing through the gilded hall and across countless radios throughout Europe. He congratulated his generals with theatrical pride, elevating several to the rank of field marshal in a ceremony designed to remind the world of Germany's unstoppable momentum. Then, nearing the end of his marathon address, he turned his attention toward the island nations still defying him. With what seemed like dramatic solemnity, Hitler declared that he felt compelled by conscience. He insisted to make one final appeal to reason and common sense in Great Britain. He stressed that he spoke not as a desperate man seeking mercy, but as a victorious statesman offering generous terms. Germany would dominate the continent. Britain would keep its global empire. The war, he implied, could end that very moment. All Churchill had to do was accept what Hitler believed inevitable. But in London, as Hitler's words spread across the airwaves, the British War Cabinet was already meeting. Winston Churchill, barely 10 weeks into his premiership, listened quietly while aides summarized the speech. The room's atmosphere thickened. Ministers waited, expecting an eruption of fury or a thunderous dismissal. Instead, Churchill simply drew on his cigar, exhaled slowly, and regarded the proposal with open contempt. According to those present, he brushed Hitler's offer aside as something so absurd it merited no consideration. Some recalled him being even harsher, muttering that the entire charade didn't deserve the dignity of acknowledgement. But personal contempt wasn't enough. Britain's allies, its dominions, and its own people needed clarity. And Hitler needed to receive Britain's answer. The only question was how. Churchill understood that a direct reply would elevate Hitler's speech to the level of serious diplomacy. Ignoring it completely risked appearing indecisive or afraid, so he chose a third path: silent defiance. He made no public statement, gave no broadcast, delivered no parliamentary address. He continued governing as if Hitler's offer had never existed. It was a masterstroke. The Führer of Germany had extended his hand, and Churchill simply walked past without a glance. But for the world beyond Britain's shores, the message needed to be spoken aloud. And Churchill selected the perfect messenger: his foreign secretary, Lord Halifax. Halifax was an unexpected choice. Before the war he had championed appeasement. He had met Hitler. He had genuinely believed stable peace with Nazi Germany might be possible. And during the dark days after Dunkirk, Halifax had argued that Britain should explore negotiations, an idea Churchill had crushed in heated cabinet debates. Now Churchill handed Halifax the task of announcing Britain's refusal. The symbolism cut deep. If even Halifax, the man most inclined toward compromise, rejected Hitler's offer, then Britain's resolve was absolute. On July 22, 1943, days after Hitler's speech, Halifax addressed the British people on BBC radio. His voice was calm, patrician, unwavering. He didn't shout, he didn't insult. He simply dismantled the German proposal by reminding listeners what the war was truly about. "We shall not stop fighting until freedom is secure," he said. "The issue is plain. It is not a question of accepting or rejecting this or that German proposal. It is a question of whether we are to submit to the threat of force, or whether we are prepared to defend our freedom." He acknowledged the sacrifice ahead, the loss, the danger, the uncertainty, but framed it as duty, even privilege. Britain was not rejecting terms. Britain was rejecting the very idea of submitting to tyranny. When word of Halifax's speech reached Berlin, Hitler was stunned. He had genuinely expected Britain to bend, convinced they would see the hopelessness of their situation. In his worldview, power dictated reality, and he believed himself to hold all of it. He couldn't fathom a nation choosing to fight on when defeat seemed certain. France lay crushed beneath German occupation. The Soviet Union, bound by its uneasy non-aggression pact with Hitler, remained silent. The United States stood apart, neutral, watchful, determined to avoid another European war. From Norway to the Mediterranean, the Reich controlled the continent. Britain was alone. Yet Hitler fundamentally misunderstood the man now leading Britain. Churchill didn't measure the world only by divisions and casualty estimates. He saw the war as a struggle for civilization itself, a contest between barbarism and the values he believed had shaped Western history. For decades he had warned about Hitler's rise while others clung to illusions of peace. He had been ignored, ridiculed, dismissed. Now that his darkest predictions had come true, he had no intention of bargaining with the man who had proved him right. Privately, Churchill was even more blunt. To his aides, he dismissed Hitler's grand speech with a single contemptuous word. To his military chiefs, he was unequivocal. There would be no negotiations, no talks, no acceptance of any German offer, while Nazism still held a gun to Europe's head. But Churchill's real answer came through action. On the very day Halifax broadcast Britain's official rejection, Churchill convened the War Cabinet and ordered immediate acceleration of the nation's defenses. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's invasion plan, was now treated as imminent. Fighter production was pushed into overdrive. Commands were streamlined. The Royal Navy increased patrols. Britain wasn't just refusing Hitler's peace. It was preparing to repel his vengeance. The gravity of that decision is almost impossible to exaggerate. Hitler's proposal, hollow as it was, represented the final possibility, however faint, for the war in Europe to end before it sprawled into the deadliest conflict in human history. Had Churchill wavered, had he agreed to even explore terms, the world would look unrecognizable today. A Europe under permanent Nazi rule. A France never liberated, a Holocaust carried out without disruption. A Soviet Union facing Germany alone. An isolated United States confronting a world divided between Nazi Europe and Imperial Japan. Churchill understood this with piercing clarity. He recognized that Hitler's peace was no peace at all, only a temporary pause that would leave tyranny in command of the continent. Accepting it would have been easier, safer, in the short term far more popular. But Churchill chose the harder path, the path of uncertainty and vast human cost. That choice reshaped the century. In the weeks following Britain's refusal, Hitler initiated the Battle of Britain. Luftwaffe bombers and fighters moved against British shipping, radar stations, and airfields. Germany had crushed Poland in weeks and France in 6. Now Hitler intended to eliminate the last barrier to total European domination. But Britain didn't break. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, fought with a ferocity that stunned German commanders. British radar, dismissed by German intelligence as insignificant, provided early warnings that saved countless pilots and aircraft. The factory workers Churchill had rallied worked around the clock, replacing every lost Spitfire and Hurricane faster than the Germans expected, and British morale held firm. Churchill's refusal to negotiate had ignited something powerful, the conviction that this war was not just military necessity but moral duty. As bombs began to fall on British cities, Churchill's rejection of Hitler's peace offer became more than diplomatic posturing. It became a symbol of resistance, of courage, of a small island nation defying a continent-spanning empire. That symbol echoed far beyond Britain's shores. Across occupied Europe, underground resistance movements took heart from the knowledge that Britain had refused to bow. In the United States, public opinion slowly, reluctantly began shifting toward viewing Britain as the last bastion of democracy worth supporting. Even inside Germany, some who had secretly hoped for peace realized with grim clarity that the war would continue until one of the two nations was utterly, irreversibly defeated. Churchill would later frame Hitler's peace offer as nothing more than an attempt to lull Britain into complacency. He insisted that no one in his government had ever taken it seriously. That was an entirely accurate Halifax, and several others had indeed discussed whether negotiations were worth entertaining, but Churchill's version of events reflected a deeper truth. To him, bargaining with Hitler was not merely impractical. It was immoral. Private letters written during those fraught weeks reveal his thinking with striking clarity. In a message to South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts, Churchill warned that Hitler's proposal was crafted to divide us from our purpose, and that accepting it would mean the death of freedom not just for Britain, but for every free people on earth. To President Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill pledged that Britain would fight on whatever the cost may be, and that no peace offer from Hitler could ever be accepted while Nazi tyranny stalked Europe. These were not political flourishes. Churchill believed them. He saw the war as a moral crusade, perhaps the last great stand of democratic civilization against the force he viewed as pure evil. Hitler was not simply another aggressive statesman. He was the embodiment of a political system that turned human life into expendable material. And Churchill believed, with unshakable conviction, that making peace with such a regime would be a betrayal of humanity itself. From Berlin, the German leadership could hardly comprehend Britain's rejection. Hitler himself was bewildered. He had assumed that once he demonstrated German dominance on the battlefield, the British would accept reality. He spoke frequently of his admiration for the British Empire and imagined a future where the world was divided between German rule in Europe and British control overseas. He believed this vision would appeal to Churchill. He was catastrophically wrong. Churchill didn't dream of sharing the world with Hitler. He dreamed of seeing him defeated, and he was willing to risk Britain's very existence to make that happen. What followed were some of the darkest months in British history. After the peace proposal collapsed, Hitler unleashed the Blitz. Night after night, the Luftwaffe pounded British cities, reducing entire neighborhoods to smoking rubble. German U-boats roamed the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. The specter of invasion hung over every military briefing, every family's dinner table. Britain faced isolation, starvation, and the real possibility of annihilation. Yet Churchill never wavered, not when London burned. Not when the casualty lists grew. Not when exhaustion settled over the nation like a shroud. Instead, he turned defiance into a weapon. He rallied the country with words that seemed to forge steel into the souls of ordinary people. He promised hardship, blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but he also promised victory, not because it was certain but because it was necessary. His refusal to consider Hitler's offer became the cornerstone of Britain's wartime identity. It told the world that Britain would not surrender, would not bargain, would not accept a peace that left tyranny triumphant. It reassured future allies that Britain would hold the line until help arrived. It gave courage to resistance fighters in occupied Europe who clung to hope that liberation would someday come. And it gave the British people themselves the conviction that their suffering had meaning, that they were fighting for more than survival. Looking back, Churchill's rejection of Hitler's July 1940 peace offer stands as one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. It was not made in panic. It was not forced by circumstance. It was a deliberate choice, a refusal to compromise with evil, even when compromise seemed the easier road. Churchill's initial reaction had been simple, even curt. He dismissed the proposal almost instantly, with language sharper than any aide dared record. But his true answer came not in a single remark but in everything he did afterward. He refused to acknowledge Hitler directly. He ordered an official rejection broadcast to the world. Then he prepared Britain for a long war, acting as though the offer had never existed at all. In that choice, calm, scornful, absolute, Churchill shaped not only Britain's wartime strategy but its enduring identity. He demonstrated that the nation would rather face ruin than surrender its principles, that it would rather fight alone than compromise with tyranny, that it would rather risk extinction than accept a peace built on the ashes of freedom. Hitler had spoken from a position of total dominance, expecting gratitude or fear. Instead, he received silence from Churchill and a firm public refusal from a united Britain. That rejection altered the course of history. It ensured the war would continue until Germany faced not only Britain, but eventually the Soviet Union and the United States as well. It marked the beginning of the long, grinding struggle that would ultimately destroy Hitler's empire. Churchill's answer to Hitler's final major peace offer addressed a question far greater than specific terms. It answered whether free nations should negotiate their survival with those who seek to destroy freedom itself. Churchill's answer was unwavering: no. And in that single word, spoken not aloud, but through resolve, he helped preserve not just Britain, but the future of a free world.